And what we'll do this week is we'll look at life under and over God. Next week we'll look at life from and for God. So if you are reading along in the book, just know that those are the chapters we're going to be covering. And then we'll spend 3 weeks talking about life with God, because ultimately that's the goal. So we're going to spend the most time on that one. So, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Thanks, Cody. All right, life under God. Life under God. Let's start here. When we look around, we see a world that is often chaotic, often uncontrollable, a lot of evil. It's often scary and unpredictable. And that can cause fear. We live in this world that's kind of crazy. And in response to our fear, what do? We seek for control. We seek to kind of protect ourselves, protect our families from this crazy world. And so we go, how do I ensure a secure future? How do I ensure that me and my family will be okay, right? Life under God says that you can find that safety and you can find stability by appeasing God. Be a good person. Obey God's commands, and God will bless you and those in your community. Disobey God, and you risk bringing curse and calamity upon yourself. We looked at this last time. There's this marionette picture that's used in the book. That's the image of kind of life under God. The marionette's like that puppet, and that we're trying to control the world. So life under God says, well, if I can control God, God controls the world, so I can control God. How do we control God? That's kind of a crazy thing to say. Life under God is basically saying we control God through our devout life, through our prayers, through being good people, through being, moral people. We basically seek control by controlling God. We live this good life that puts God in our debt, and so God blesses us. God has to do what we want, right? We may not say it that way, but that's how people can live. If I kind of live this holy life, then God should answer my prayers. God should bless me. God should do the things I ask of him. So it's at the end of the day, it looks really devout, it looks faithful, but at the end of the day, it's just another way of looking for control. Does that make sense? And so, as with all of these different postures, there is some truth to this. There is some kernel of truth to each of these. And the kernel of truth here is that God's commands are meant to lead to a better life. I mean, we see that all throughout, the book of Deuteronomy. Actually, 8 different times in the book of Deuteronomy, God says, hey, here's why I'm giving you all these commands. God himself says, look, 8 different times he says things like this in Deuteronomy 12. Be careful to obey all these regulations I'm giving you so that it may always go well with you and your children after you, because you'll be doing what is good and right in the eyes of the Lord your God, right? And so let's acknowledge, amen. The point of God's commands they're not just arbitrary. They are meant to live to a more blessed life. Or we might reference in the New Testament, Galatians chapter 6. It says in Galatians 6, 7, and 8, it says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life, right? So again, we need to obey God. God's commands are good, and ultimately we're going to reap what we sow. So that's the caveat. That being said, I think the Bible acknowledges that life isn't always quite that simple. And over in John chapter 9, there's this interesting interaction with Jesus and a blind man. In John 9, verse 1, it says, as he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Isn't that interesting? The assumption what? They just had this assumption that this guy's blind, so someone must have messed up. Either this guy or his parents, someone must have sinned, and this is God's punishment for that. Right? That was the assumption. And Jesus actually says, that's actually not true. That's not true. There's something bigger going on here. This is actually for God's glory. There's a bigger story here than just someone's getting punished for sinning. And I think the point there is that bad things are not necessarily the result of disobedience. Sometimes they are. Okay, sometimes they are. The addict who loses their wife and kids because they can't control their addiction, is going to reap what they sow. Right? The bad thing is the result of their disobedience. They're going against God's ways. But the person with perhaps, let's say, chronic pain, who suffers day in and day out with chronic pain, isn't necessarily suffering just because God is punishing them. There might be a bigger story. And I think if for some of us, we can be these guilty souls. Let's be honest, we can be these guilty souls and just assume this bad thing's happening because, God must be mad at me. But that's not necessarily true. Bad things are not always the result of disobedience, but the opposite's also true. Blessings are not necessarily proof of holiness. We see that with the rich man in Matthew 19. Jesus challenges this rich young man to sell everything and follow him, right? And it says, when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. Then Jesus said to his disciples, truly, I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished. They asked, who then can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. But notice, Jesus says, look, it's hard for someone who's rich to be saved. And notice the disciples' response. They're just blown away. They're like, what? They're flabbergasted. They're greatly astonished. Why are they so astonished? Well, just as it was assumed that the blind man must be a sinner, it was assumed that the rich must be a saint. Because God curses the disobedience, but he blesses the obedience always. That was kind of the basic assumption. They thought if you obey God, he blesses you. So if someone was rich, they must have been obedient. God must be rewarding them for their faith, their holiness. Their riches must be proof of God's approval. But now here's Jesus once again saying, it's not that simple. It's not necessarily the case. Remember the tweet last time from Steve Johnson, the football player? Sorry, my clicker's struggling. You remember this one? He's a football player. They lost to their rivals, and he was the one who dropped the pass in overtime. And then he tweets this at God, apparently, and says, hey, God, what gives? Like, I praise you 24/7, and this is how you do me. Like, he's so upset because, again, there's this assumption, I obey God. God, you're supposed to bless me. What's going on? If I obey God, he should bless my life. This is one of the problems with life under God. It leaves us confused and discouraged when things don't go our way. Many people who were unknowingly living life under God have left Christianity because they concluded it just doesn't work. I tried Christianity, didn't work. Most likely living this posture without realizing it. I tried doing this, God didn't deliver, so I just gave it up. Jesus continually pushed against this way of viewing life under God. He does it strongest with the Pharisees. In Matthew 23 is just this whole chapter where Jesus just kind of rips apart the Pharisees. But it starts in verse 4 here. Jesus, talking about the Pharisees, says, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. He's talking about the Pharisees, these religious leaders. And these heavy loads Jesus refers to are of course, they're not physical loads, but they're these loads of spiritual perfection. And the Pharisees believed that the welfare of Israel depended on everyone's obedience to God. There was this belief that once everyone finally got their act together, that God would finally bring the Messiah and restore Israel to its rightful glory. And, if you know your Bible, you know that the Messiah they expected was kind of like a second David, so kind of a military leader who would, kick out the Romans and restore Israel to its earthly power, its earthly splendor and riches and its territory, right? And they thought, until everyone kind of is holy and starts obeying, God's not going to send the Messiah. And so what happens if you live in a culture like that? Well, the Pharisees basically become the police of everyone else. That you go, not only do I need to be holy for God to bless me, but I need to make sure everyone else is holy so that God will take care of us in our country and bless, Israel or whatever. And what made the burden so heavy is that the Pharisees didn't just want them to obey the Bible. They wanted them to obey all the extra stuff they came up with over the years. It's called the Mishnah. It was the rabbinical laws, basically these extra commands to kind of just put a hedge, they call it a hedge around the law, just to make sure, if this is the command and we don't want to break the command, well, let's add an extra command so we don't even get close to breaking the real command. So they had all these bonus commands, and they just put all that on everybody, expecting everyone to live by these high, heavy standards, and it just didn't work. It didn't help people. As long as the Messiah didn't come, it must be because people aren't obeying. But the same kind of thing happens today when we live life under God. Life under God turns us into the religious police of everyone else. And like the Pharisees, we can kind of just get self-righteous and we can start blaming our own hardships on the sins of other people. For example, in the book, Jethani quotes this Christian leader who, during 9/11, this Christian leader basically talks about how the pagans, the abortionists, the feminists, the gays, the lesbians have all contributed to 9/11. Because by their actions, God has removed his hand of protection from the United States. Now, that was a well-known pastor making that comment. That's a completely false assumption. Of course, we don't agree with those lifestyles at all. But to blame them for calamity on our country reveals a completely misguided understanding of God. Life under God makes it very easy to get sucked into the culture war. Because we think that, okay, if America just got back to its Christian roots, maybe things would finally be better. And so what happens is we spend all of our energy barking at people on the other side of the fence, whoever that person happens to be, or those people happen to be. Worrying, fighting, whoever's on the other side, in hopes that, hey, if we could just finally get the morals straight back in our country, God will bless us again. That's exactly what the Pharisees wanted in Israel. The truth is, the Christian roots of our country don't exist. Most of our founding fathers were deists, which is a far cry from biblical Christianity. But even if they were solid Christians, the answer to our problems is not policing everyone else in their obedience. To do that is to go backwards 700 years to the Inquisition, and you can Google that if you want to know how well that worked out. But the point is, the Pharisees tied up these heavy loads. Compare that to Jesus. Okay, compare that to Jesus. What does Jesus say? Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Right? Jesus invites those who are burdened to come to him. Jesus does have a burden for us to bear. He does have things for us to obey. There is a yoke that we are to carry, but it's easy and it's light. And the final thing I'll say here is that Jesus not only taught against life under God, he really modeled it with how he lived. Jesus frequently welcomed the type of people who, for the Pharisees, were like the problem with this country. Jesus often ate with tax collectors, prostitutes, sinners, right? The very people who, in the minds of the Pharisees, were keeping the Messiah from coming. And Jesus certainly didn't welcome their sin. Jesus didn't sin with sinners, but he ate with sinners. He didn't welcome their sin, but he welcomed the sinner. The Pharisees were always questioning him about it. They're like, why do you eat with these people? Why do you associate with these dirty people? And they couldn't understand why this young rabbi would risk perhaps being punished by God for associating with these people. One of my favorite quotes in this chapter was here on page 39. Jethani says, while the religious leaders sought obedience and conformity of behavior, Jesus sought to welcome people back into relationship with God. He inspired love and compassion, not simply sacrifice. That was Jesus' mantra over and over. When you read through Matthew, he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He says it over and over. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus wasn't just looking at people's outward actions. Jesus looked at the heart. And that was the problem with the Pharisees. Jesus compares them to dishes that are washed on the outside but not the inside. He compares them to tombs that are beautiful on the outside but full of rotting bones and flesh on the inside. They looked good outwardly, but their hearts were far from him. Okay, so it's just some questions for us to consider when we think about life under God. Are you more concerned about your outward appearance as a Christian or about your heart before God? Are we more worried about looking the part or the state of our hearts? Okay, and then secondly, before you go policing people in our country or people at your workplace or even the people under your own roof, how's your heart? Before you go worrying about other people's obedience, how's yours? How's your own heart doing? Jesus says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Would you say the same? That you desire mercy? Is that your heart towards the people on the other side? Those people, you know what I'm talking about. You have someone who comes to mind when I say those people. Is your heart towards them mercy? Because that was Jesus' heart. On a different note, do you tend to see your suffering as God's punishment? When bad things happen, are you one of those guilty souls that just kind of feels like, man, God's punishing me for something. I must have done something wrong. We could spend a lot of time on that, but just know that God is much more gracious than that. Now, all the punishment has already been given to Jesus on the cross. And finally, do you feel that your faith is a heavy burden or a light and easy yoke? I'll be honest, there's been times in the years even where I've felt like my faith is just burdensome. I just don't think that's what Jesus desires for us. Does your faith feel like a heavy burden or a light and easy yoke? And why? What makes it feel like that? Okay, so let those questions marinate. We're going to have some time to talk about these together when we're done. Does that sound good? So I'll put these back up on the screen. But for now, let's continue on to life over God. How are we doing? Doing okay? I know this is it feels a little more like lecture-y. I'm sorry for that. I'm trying not to be overly just teachy today, but hopefully that in our discussion and things we can unpack some of this and apply it some more. But life over God. Life over God finds its roots in the Enlightenment. Okay, so if you're not familiar with the Enlightenment, in the 16 and 1700s, there was this shift in just thinking, this shift in thought towards trusting in reason, trusting in science, rather than trusting in any kind of God or superstition or whatever. So let's be clear, science is not the enemy, okay? God, faith and science go together beautifully. Let's not be those people who, reject science, amen? That's another sermon for another day. The point here is that with the Enlightenment, people began trusting in reason and what could be proven and what, natural laws and principles, things that you could test, rather than in God. And it kind of leads to this posture of life over God. You remember this marionette picture? In this view, we don't really need God. Notice God is off to the side. We don't really need God to control our world. We just need to understand the laws and principles that he's put in place. And so God's off to the side. We can control it. The strings of the marionette are like God's laws and principles. And if we can figure those out, we can control things around us. And so the Enlightenment is still affecting us 400 years later. In its extreme form, life over God looks like atheism, right? Just say, I'm over God, I don't need God. I can just rely on natural law, I can rely on my reason. In its extreme form, life over God looks like atheism. But even for Christians, we too can fall into this trap of relying on God's principles more than on God himself. We said this last time, but it's this idea of if you see the Bible as just kind of the repair manual for life, why bother with the mechanic? Right? If you can just figure out God's ways, God's principles, it's entirely possible to do things God's way and yet never even talk to or know God. And so Let's look at an example of this in Scripture. If you would look over here at Exodus with me. We'll start in Exodus 17. In Exodus 17, we have this example of Moses. We'll start in verse 5. People they're wandering through the desert. People are asking for water. It's a tough situation. They're in the middle of the wilderness, and they need to get water for the people. And so in Exodus 17, verse 5, the Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Okay, so God says, hey, take the staff that you used to struck the Nile, strike this certain rock, and water will come out. So Moses does it. Lo and behold, it works. So there's this amazing miracle. God provides water in the middle of the desert. Water comes out of this rock. It's crazy. And the people have water to drink. Okay, now keep that in mind. Fast forward in the story to Numbers 20. And if you would, read this with me because I don't have all the text on the screen. Numbers 20. Go forward a couple books. Here we have the same situation. Once again, the people are in the desert. They're thirsty. That's what happens when you're wandering in the desert. And they're complaining. They're grumbling against Moses. They feel like, why did you bring us out here to die in the middle of the desert? What's going on? They're starting to kind of get rebellious. They're starting to question Moses and his leadership. And so we'll just start in verse 1. Numbers 20, verse 1. It says, "In the first month of the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, 'If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place? There's no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink.' Verse 6, Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, 'Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so that they and their livestock can drink.' So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock?' Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them.'" We'll stop there. What's happening here? So, again, just like we saw in Exodus, Moses is under pressure to deliver. The people are getting upset. They're like, "We have no water. Why'd you bring us out here? We're going to die," right? And they're grumbling, they're complaining. Moses is under pressure to do something. Now, throughout the story, if you know your Bible, throughout this whole Exodus story, God has often worked through this staff. For some reason, God says he's going to work through the staff. You remember the staff turns into a snake when Moses throws it down before Pharaoh. That was one of the signs that was meant to convince Pharaoh. When Moses struck the Nile, the water turns into blood. That was another one of the signs to convince Pharaoh. When Moses raised the staff over the Red Sea parted, right? And back in Exodus, in the passage we just read, when Moses strikes the rock, water comes out. And so for some reason, God has chosen to work through this magical stick. Okay, so here, what happens though is now you have a repeatable principle. There's this repeatable, reliable principle. And the thing is, this one time, God doesn't tell Moses to strike the rock. Did you catch what God tells him to do? To speak to it. Yeah. He says, "Take the staff." Yeah, but I want you to speak to the rock. Interesting, a little different than in the past. But then down in verses 10 and 11, what does Moses actually do? says he strikes it. Strikes the rock twice. Right? He relies on the principle, on what's always worked in the past. Let me do that again. He doesn't speak to the rock, he strikes it with the staff. Now notice the result. Two things happen. One, water comes out of the rock. Even though Moses doesn't do what God commanded, for some reason, God still lets it work. We'll come back to that idea in a minute. But the second thing that happens is that God actually really disciplines Moses pretty severely. After all that Moses has done to lead the people out of out of Egypt and free them from slavery, lead them through the desert, Moses, because of this one incident, Moses is now banned from entering the promised land. He dies in sight of it. What does all this tell us? I think on one hand, we can't put God in a box, okay? Just because God worked a certain way in the past does not mean that he will necessarily work the same way now. And so we need to be careful about talking about God with phrases like God always, God never, God only, right? There are certain aspects of God that we can totally rely on. God's love, God's faithfulness. But we need to just have a healthy dose of humility when we talk about God and tell other people about God, and not presume to have God all figured out and reduced to some easy formula. But the second thing I think we see here is that God seems to care more about faithfulness than effectiveness. Because let me ask you guys, in this scenario, was Moses effective? Totally. Got water to come out of the rock. I mean, in the eyes of the people, they were like, woo, Moses is our hero, go Moses, right? It worked. Even though he disobeys God, for some reason, God still allows the method to work. And the people probably saw it as this huge success, and yet that's not how God saw it. God didn't see it as a success. God wanted faithfulness, and he disciplines Moses for his disobedience. So you can use God's principles to be effective or successful in any area, whether you're talking about, your marriage or your finances or your outreach, right? You can do it God's way. You can do it with God's principles, but we have to be careful because good results does not necessarily equal God's approval, right? A big, thriving, growing church doesn't necessarily mean God's with it. Whether that's a church or your household or your Bible talk, whatever. We see this in Matthew 7. I know we know this one. Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons? And in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers,'" right? You look at these people and what they're doing. Preaching in the name of Jesus. Performing miracles, many miracles, driving out demons. I mean, by all external accounts, these are very effective Christians. And yet their effectiveness does not mean that Jesus approves of it. Jesus says, "I never knew you." And I think that's the danger of life over God. We can substitute knowing God's commands for actually knowing God. You can know all these commands and still not know God. That's the danger. So it's just some diagnostic questions as we transition to our time of discussion here. I like this quote. This is actually from the book. He asks, if God's Spirit left your church, or substitute in your family group or your house, would you notice? Would anything even be different? Right? I think because it gets to the heart of fundamentally, are we relying on our own planning and our own strategies and our own whatever? Or are we relying on God and his Spirit? Secondly, is there an area of your life in which you rarely or never include God? Is there an area? You just go, I don't even think to talk to God about this or bring God into this. What do you rely on instead in that area? What might it look like to include God? And I think lastly here is, how do you view the Bible? Because this kind of is a big part of this for Christians. living life over God is, how do you view the Bible? If someone new to faith, if someone wasn't a Christian, didn't know anything about God, and they asked you, what is the Bible? How would you respond? Okay, because I think a lot of times we can have traces of these postures. We live with we might not be overtly like life over God or life under God, but we can have these traces of it and how we think and how we talk to God and how we relate to God. People with traces of life over God tend to view the Bible as just kind of an instruction manual for life. When really, it's a lot more. It's more of a window to the heart of God, into seeing the things the way God sees them. So what role should the Bible play? You can look at that scripture if you want. So I just want to have some discussion time. Let's take the next 10 minutes or so. I'll leave these questions up here. And then in about 5 minutes, I'll switch to the other slide from the first half. And so just whatever rings true. You don't have to talk about all of them, but let's have maybe groups of 3. Let's keep them smaller groups so that we can have time to share. Groups of 3, and let's just have some time to discuss. Ready, go.